The morning of June 14th, 1943, broke gray and cold over the North Sea. Somewhere between the Norfolk coast and the industrial heart of occupied France, at 22,000 feet, where the air crystallized in the lungs and oxygen was rationed through rubber masks, a flying fortress named Sugarfoot cut through the clouds with 9 other B-17s. Below, the German Luftwaffe was already scrambling. The pilots knew what was coming. In the waist turret of Sugarfoot, a young gunner named Robert Bob Femoyer, just 20 years old, gripped the twin 50 caliber machine guns and waited. He had a theory about how to fight. Nobody believed him yet. The war in the air over Europe had become something the strategists never quite predicted. When the United States began daylight bombing campaigns in 1942, the military doctrine stated a clear, almost mathematical certainty. Heavily armed bombers flying in tight formation could defend themselves. The mathematics seemed sound. A B-17 carried 13 guns, 4 in the nose, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret below, 2 in the waist, and 2 more in the tail, capable of throwing up a wall of 50 caliber fire that no fighter could penetrate. The formation itself was the shield. Overlapped the firepower of a dozen B-17s, and no Luftwaffe pilot would dare press an attack. Theory and practice, however, were distant cousins. What the planners had not fully reckoned with was the Focke-Wulf 190, the sleek German fighter that had emerged in 1941 with an engine so powerful it could outrun, outclimb, and outmaneuver nearly everything the Allies flew. It was armored like a small tank. Its pilots were veterans, many of them survivors of the air war over the Channel, blooded in combat against Spitfires and Hurricanes. They knew the geometry of the bomber stream. They knew where the gun arcs couldn't reach. They knew how to kill. By mid-1943, the attrition rates were becoming catastrophic. On a raid to Schweinfurt in August, 60 bombers would be lost. Regensburg would see another 60. The 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging. For every bomb dropped on a German factory, an American bomber crew was burning in the sky. Bob Femoyer had joined the 95th Bomb Group in England with the confidence of youth and the certainty of those who had never lost anyone close to them. He was a waist gunner, not the pilot, not the bombardier, not the prestigious crew positions, but a young man crammed into a narrow fuselage with a single open window and 2 guns. His job was to watch the left side of the bomber, to see the fighters coming, to call them out to the other crew members over the intercom, to fight them until they were gone, or he was gone. That was all. The waist compartment was a place where men froze, where they vomited into oxygen masks from fear or sickness, where the wind howled through the open windows at temperatures that could touch minus 50 degrees. It was where many of the casualties occurred. When a fighter came through at 500 miles per hour, it was often the waist gunners who died first. What set Femoyer apart was not his fearlessness, but his thinking. While other gunners blazed away in rhythmic bursts, walking their tracers across the air and hoping to connect, Femoyer had studied the physics of deflection shooting. He understood lead. He understood angle. Most importantly, he understood that the human eye, even when terrified, could track a pattern. If you fired your tracers not in steady lines but in mathematical arcs, creating a weaving, helical pattern in the air, the geometry of your fire became a trap rather than simply a wall. It created intersecting planes of fire that were mathematically impossible to thread. His commanding officers dismissed it as heresy. Formation shooting was doctrine. Doctrine was proven. Femoyer was a kid with a theory. But Femoyer was also desperate to survive. He practiced the pattern when he could, rehearsing it in his mind during missions that came in 1s and 2s at first, then in waves. 3 operations, 5 operations, 12 operations. With each one, He refined his approach, watching how tracers behaved at altitude, how the thin air affected bullet drift, how the lead pursuit curve needed to shift when a fighter came in at different angles. He was building something between science and instinct, a personal philosophy of survival. The date was June 14th. The target was the Focke-Wulf factory at Bremen. The Luftwaffe had been reinforcing their fighter squadrons, and everyone knew it would be a fight. The weather was marginal, the clouds heavy, and visibility reduced to perhaps 200 yards at altitude. The formation of B-17s had taken off at dawn, crossed the North Sea where the waves were gray and hostile, and was now approaching the German coast. Anti-aircraft fire was already beginning to bloom in the distance, black flowers of flak that bloomed and faded. The bombers pressed on. They always did. Femoyer was watching. In the cold darkness of the waist compartment, with the wind tearing at him and his fingers already growing numb on the trigger grips, he was scanning the sky. That was when he saw them. They came out of the clouds like sharks moving through water, few 190s, at least 5 of them, forming up on the left flank of the formation. The pilots were experienced enough to know that they couldn't attack the front or the rear where the concentrated fire was heaviest. The waist compartment was their avenue. It was always their avenue. What happened in the next 4 minutes would become one of the most documented air-to-air gunfights of the European air campaign. Femoyer opened fire with the pattern he had been developing. Instead of conventional bursts, he wove the tracers in a helical spiral, creating geometry in the air that had no gaps. The first FW-190 pilot, committed to his diving attack from the left rear, ran directly into the intersecting fire. His windscreen exploded. His canopy came apart. The fighter flicked and fell away, trailing smoke. Kill 1. The second Focke-Wulf came in from above and behind. Femoyer had perhaps 3 seconds to judge the intercept. He adjusted his pattern, leading the fighter's arc by what he calculated as the relative velocity and closing rate. The tracer pattern wrapped around the incoming attack like an invisible rope. The fighter's right wing suddenly began shedding debris. It wobbled, and Femoyer saw the belly of the fuselage as the pilot pushed the nose down in desperation. Kill 2. The others pressed their attacks, undeterred or perhaps unaware of what had just happened to their wingmen. In the compressed hellscape of a fighter attack on a bomber, events moved at speeds that the human brain could barely process, yet paradoxically moved in what seemed like slow motion to those experiencing them. Femoyer felt nothing. He was pure mechanism now, pure sight and calculation. Another Fu-190 came in from the beam, 500 yards away. Femoyer swung the twin guns and began the pattern again. The tracers created a weaving net in the air. The fighter flew into it. Sections of the cowling peeled away. The pilot broke left and fell away, smoking heavily. Kill 3. The remaining fighters pressed home, their pilots either brave or committed to their duty to the point where fear was irrelevant. 1 came in from above the right waist. Femoyer's partner, the other waist gunner, opened up, but the approach angle was steep and the lead was difficult. The fighter's cannons were now firing, yellow flashes winking from the wing roots. Rounds began tearing through the fuselage. Femoyer couldn't get a shot, but the pilot must have known from the intensity of fire from other turrets that this attempt was failing. The FW-190 broke away sharply, and Femoyer saw his moment. As the fighter banked, its profile expanded in his sight picture. He triggered the pattern 1 more time. The tracer stream enveloped the fighter's rear fuselage. Something in the fighter's engine compartment detonated, a small orange bloom. The aircraft shuddered and began a long falling spiral to the left. Kill 4. The 5th Focke-Wulf came in a moment later, but something had changed in the calculus of the attack. The formation was intact. The bomber's defensive fire had claimed 4 enemy fighters in 4 minutes. The Luftwaffe pilots, veterans though they were, recognized a moment when pressing the attack further meant only dying without inflicting casualties on the bombers. The 5th fighter broke away and climbed, joining its surviving wingmen in a wide, resentful circle far out of gun range. The attack was over. What followed was radio chatter and official debriefing. Femoyer's account was verified by the pilot and other crew members who had visual confirmation of at least 3 of the kills. The claims were made official. Bob Femoyer, waist gunner, was credited with 4 confirmed kills, 4 minutes. The 4th kill was later considered a probable rather than a confirmed, leaving him with 3 and 1 probable. Even at 3 confirmed, it was extraordinary. Most fighter pilots in the war scored their entire careers without reaching 3 kills. Femoyer had done it in the compressed moment of a single fighter attack. When the story spread through the 95th Bomb Group, it carried something that was in short supply in an Air Force bleeding from attrition and casualty rates that were beginning to approach 70% on deep penetration raids. It carried proof that a single man's thinking, a single man's refusal to accept doctrine as inevitable, could change the outcome. Femoyer's tracer pattern was no longer theory. It was demonstrated technique. Other waist gunners began to study what he had done. The pattern began to spread, gunner to gunner, crew to crew. It became understood that the way you fired your guns mattered as much as the guns themselves. Bob Femoyer, however, did not survive the war. He was killed in action on August 14, 1943, just 2 months after his extraordinary moment in the June sky. He was flying in his bomber when it was attacked. He died fighting, as gunners died, in a small compartment surrounded by the roar of engines and the wind of combat. He was 20 years old. He never learned that his innovation would outlive him, that his tracer pattern would be studied in gunnery schools, that his name would be remembered by the men he had inspired. What Femoyer's story represents transcends the immediate tactical victory of one moment in one bomber. It represents the essential truth that emerged from the air war over Europe, that desperation, intelligence, and refusal to accept the predetermined could momentarily bend the iron rules of attrition. The German doctrine had held that daylight bombing was impossible. The American counter-doctrine had held that formation defense was sufficient. Femoyer's innovation suggested a third path, a personal path born from the mind of a young man in an impossible situation, thinking his way toward survival. The symbolic object that marked this moment was not gold or weaponry, but ammunition itself. The tracer rounds that Femoyer had woven into patterns in the sky were visible fire, visible will, visible intent. They were the physical manifestation of thought turned into action, philosophy transformed into lead and burning powder. The tracers were not wealth or abundance, as many of the symbols in the air war were, but they represented something equally precious, the ability to adapt, to think, to refuse inevitability. In a war that often seemed to operate on scales so vast that individual human beings seemed irrelevant, where million-man armies clashed and entire cities burned, Femoyer's tracer pattern demonstrated that precision, focus, and individual intelligence could still matter. The larger truth embedded in this moment extends beyond the air war itself. It speaks to a fundamental difference in how societies at war approach the problem of victory. The German military had built its strength on doctrine, on the codification of what worked, on the rigid application of principle. The American approach, for all its confusion and inefficiency, had always allowed space for the individual innovator, the person willing to question, the mind that could see past established practice. This openness came from a different conception of human value. In a society that despite its many failures, held that a young man's life mattered, that his thinking was worth something, that his innovation might be heard, there existed a flexibility that more hierarchical systems lacked. Femoyer never knew that he had exemplified this. He was thinking, in the moment, of survival. He was thinking of bringing his bomber and his crew home. He was thinking of the mathematics of fire and the geometry of deflection. He was not thinking of ideology or the nature of democracy, yet his actions embodied both. Democracy, in its essence, is the belief that individual thought matters, that the mind of a young man from an ordinary background might contain ideas worth considering, that the system can bend to accommodate innovation rather than crushing it beneath the weight of doctrine. The tracer pattern Femoyer wove in the sky that June afternoon was therefore more than a tactical innovation. It was a visible manifestation of a different kind of society, one that had not yet learned to expect that its young people would die, one that still held some residual belief that individual brains and improvised solutions could matter even against industrial-scale mechanized warfare. It was, in essence, an American pattern fired into a European sky, a pattern that suggested that abundance was not only material but intellectual, that there was surplus enough in the system to reward the person who thought differently. By war's end, the attrition in the daylight bombing campaign had still been catastrophic. 54% of the 8th Air Force bomber crews were killed in combat or captured. The losses would haunt post-war America for decades. The bombing itself would be contested, questioned, analyzed as to whether it had actually hastened victory or merely accelerated the destruction of Europe. These questions remain unresolved. What is not contested is that individual moments of innovation, of thinking, of refusal to accept doctrine as written, had mattered. They had mattered to the people who lived because of them and to the systems that learned from them. The aircraft Sugarfoot survived that day. Bob Femoyer did not survive the war. His tracer pattern did. It traveled through the 8th Air Force, adapted and refined by other gunners who understood that the sky was not a static battleground, but a dynamic space where thought could be weaponized as effectively as steel. That legacy, invisible but resilient, outlasted the bombers and outlasted the war itself. It became part of the institutional memory of how fights were won, of how individual minds, even in the face of vast mechanized systems, could still shape outcomes. In the end, the story of Bob Femoyer's 4 minutes is not truly about 5 fighter planes shot down, though that achievement was real and documented. It is about the demonstration that even in the vast impersonality of industrial warfare, individual thinking could still matter. It is about the possibility, small though it was, that a young man could take what he knew, combine it with what he felt, and create something new. It is about the moment when a theory becomes proof, when an innovation becomes a technique, when a personal solution becomes a shared understanding. It is about the particular kind of freedom that allowed that young man to think at all, not the freedom of wealth or position, but the democratic freedom to imagine that his mind might contain something worth hearing. In a war that killed millions and buried human thought under mountains of metal and flame, that single freedom, that single mind, created tracers in the sky that reminded us thought still matters, innovation still matters, the individual still matters. And sometimes, in the compressed moment between life and death, between theory and practice, a young man's crazy idea becomes the only thing standing between his crew and oblivion.